Check, check. 1, 2, 3, check, check. Hello, hello.
Hello, check. Hello, hello, check. Hello, 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 check. Hello. It will come.
Hello, hello. Mic testing.
Check, check. Hi everyone, welcome to the grand finals of NALSAR IV 2022. Congratulations to all teams and judges for making it this far. On opening government, we have Illuminati confirmed. On opening opposition, we have COEP X VIT. On closing government, we have Tomar Nam, Amar Nam, Vietnam. And on closing opposition, we have Baji and Srishant. My name is Aina. I will be your chair for today. Judging with me are... Okay. Yeah. Judging with me are Abhilash, Abhishek, Devashish, Pranav, Priyanka and Shivam. Just refer to us collectively as panel. I think that's about it. So we'll just do a quick round of team introductions. I don't know if we have a mic, so just yell out your introductions in your speaker order. Opening government. Closing up. Great, thank you all so much. Just as a quick announcement, if everyone can try and keep as silent as you can be through the debate, that would be super helpful. Prime Minister, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Here, here.
Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello.
Hi, can you hear me? POIs, raise your hand. Okay. For POIs, raise your hand, preferably towards the end of the fifth closing opposition. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm so sorry. God, my time. Yeah. Panel, we live in a world wherein majority of the minorities face discrimination by virtue of them being different from the majoritarian communities, and that is what they used to go ahead and villainize against them at all points in time to begin with. We want to change that on our side of the house to begin with. 1. What does these disadvantaged groups essentially look like? 4 things. 1. We think so these groups face social isolation by virtue of the distinctiveness that they essentially have. But secondarily, there's heavy otherization of these people and these community from the majoritarian community at large to begin with. But third, we think so because of this distinctiveness at large, there's lack of opportunities that they essentially get. They don't get that kind of opportunities to be able to assimilate with the society in general to begin with. But fourth, we think so there's massive stigmatization of particular communities by virtue of them being different from the majoritarian communities in general to begin with. But second, how does this implementation essentially look like on our side of the house? 3 things. 1, we think so that essentially looks like you going ahead and finding common grounds based on some sort of intersectionality that you essentially have, primarily because every individual have intersectional identities and they can have different identities that can relate to one person over the other person. But second, we think so that social movements go ahead and use these as an argument to push forward for how Dalits are also Hindus, thereby they should also have a common ground to different issues in general to begin with, thereby going ahead and showcasing some sort of commonality between these kind of communities at large, right? But thirdly, we think so it also looks like how both the communities can go ahead and coexist within the same society, and they can go ahead and live in conformity instead of going ahead and showcasing how one community is distinctively different from the other community at large to begin with. But thirdly, what's the metric of the debate? We think so that human beings necessarily go ahead and care about living a dignified life at all points in time to begin with, and having greater social interaction and a dignified social interaction in general. We think so the team which is able to go ahead and prove that at the end of the day is able to take this debate. But firstly, why does emphasizing on conformity essentially go ahead and work for these minority communities in general? 1, we think so that any any oppression essentially goes ahead and arises out of the differences that communities necessarily have, and the differences that they essentially go ahead and find grounds on in terms of discriminating other people in general. The fact that you are different from one community leads to people going ahead and discriminating them or using them as a means to villainize them on that particular ground in general. At that point in time, that essentially looks like white people going ahead and discriminating black people by virtue of the difference of their skin color in general. But second, we think so that human beings are social animals, right? At that point in time, they generally like to interact with people who they find like more conformed to and who they are like generally generally have common grounds with, right? Intuition pump being birds of feather flock together. If I like a particular show and you do too, at that point in time, I'm likely to have more common grounds to go ahead and interact with, but also able to go ahead and find like good interaction in general instead of a person who I find doesn't have any common grounds with me in general, right? But thirdly, we think so that it essentially goes ahead and creates a dissonance in the minds of the oppressor, right? How does that necessarily happen? One, we think so that when you essentially go ahead and see a black child studying in the same class as a white child, you go ahead and recognize the fact that this person is also your classmate as well. Thereby, you are likely going to go ahead and interact with them on the grounds of the fact that they are the same person studying the same kind of subjects that you are and in the same class as you are. Instead of going ahead and discriminating them based on the color of their skin in general, you're likely going to go ahead and prioritize the commonalities that you essentially have and using that as a means to further your interaction with them in general, right? But fourthly, we think so that there's what's the cognitive conceptualization that essentially human beings have, right? We think so that human beings are likely to interact with people that they essentially go ahead and relate to instead of people who they have no commonalities in general to begin with. At that point in time, we think so as an individual from a minority community, you get better interaction with majority community so that you are able to better interact with them, but also talk about your lived experiences at large in general. At a point in time, you have common grounds to go ahead and establish that kind of social interaction instead of being isolated by them at all points in time to begin with. What's the impact of this? One, we think so that it brings about some sort of ideological change in the minds of the human beings in general, primarily because they're able to go ahead and conceptualize that as a means that you are somebody who is common or who is similar to me in different ways in general. But second, we think so that human beings now go ahead and see similarity, which necessarily goes ahead and leads them to go ahead and establish dignified interactions with you instead of going ahead and discriminating you on different regards, right? That essentially looks like less microaggression, less discrimination at a grassroots level, primarily because you don't go ahead and see different aspects, but the aspects that could be similar to that particular person in general to begin with. But thirdly, you get better buy-in for your community at large to begin with, right? Why do you get better buy-in? Primarily because at a point in time, you have better commonalities with that particular person. You're likely going to go ahead and see them as somebody who can further your community as well at the end of the day, instead of going ahead and seeing them in opposition to your own community at large, right? At that point in time, we think so that buy-in is something which is essentially important, primarily because as minorities, you need support to go ahead and get any sort of affirmative change at large to begin with, right? At that point in time, we think so that you essentially get more votes in terms of policy formation. At a point in time, you get majority community going ahead and being in your allyship in general, but you can go ahead and push forward more policy, primarily because you get more allies on our side of the house and you get less opposition on our side of the house. In general, your lobbying power is increased, right? But secondarily, why does distinctiveness necessarily not work on that side of the house to begin with? At that point in time, the first thing, one, we think so that human beings are largely risk averse, right? They don't want to go ahead and get into unknown territories that they can't go ahead and relate to. At that point in time, that essentially looks like white parents going ahead and telling their children that, oh, this person is different by virtue of their skin color, thereby you shouldn't go ahead and interact with them. They don't want their children to go ahead and explore that kind of territory on your side of the house to begin with. But second, we think so that human beings are largely self-centered before that closing. We think so that depends on how people have been able to internalize that particular idea, right? At a point in time, social movements largely go ahead and push forward this idea of how you have commonalities with different people. We think so that can also be internalized as a narrative and can be pushed forward by these minorities to go ahead and create some kind of commonalities for them to go ahead and interact on in general, right? But second, in terms of self-centeredness, we think so that human beings largely exist in echo chamber. They don't go ahead and think of other communities and only care about themselves on their side of the house to begin with. At a point in time, they see some sort of similarity on our side. We think so they'll be able to go ahead and fulfill some sort of proximate obligation on our side, right? But lastly, in terms of narrative in society, we think so the narrative necessarily focuses on some sort of characterization of cultures which are necessarily go ahead and are different in general. At that point in time, they're likely going to go ahead and interpret your culture in a different manner by virtue of the fact that they don't have any sort of common ground in general and they have no incentive to talk to by virtue of the differentiation that necessarily happened, right? But fourthly, in terms of threat, we think so that people are likely going to go ahead and see that as a threat, primarily because the act of portraying yourself as different can be seen as an active threat for their position and the power that they could essentially get in the future in general, right? Even if opposition goes ahead and proves that you can come up with good things which are distinctive, we think so there are ingrained biases within the mind of the people, thereby they're likely going to go ahead and prioritize the differences instead of seeing any sort of common grounds on our side of the house. There varies impact in terms of the fact that you get active opposition in terms of any sort of policy change, but the resources that you use in terms of policy change is significantly increased on that side of the house. We think so it's better to pander to people to be able to get any sort of affirmative change because of those reasons, OG.
Hi, just confirming, am I audible? Cool. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Before I get into explicit responses to opening comment, note there's a few structural reasons for why going up the ladder or like just getting benefits for minorities is something that's difficult in general. Note there's huge generational wealth that has been acquired by majoritarian communities which they use to exploit minorities. There's internalized biases that already do exist in the minds of people. Changing these biases is something that's extremely difficult. Life in general is a zero-sum game. The majority communities keep on benefiting at the expense of minorities, but they also through politics employ tactics like gerrymandering to make sure these issues are never solved in the first place. Sure, in their world, might say that like Dalits and Hindus are exactly the same, and if that does work, that this means you have conformed to the norm. But that means that the same opponents are going to push, opponents of you are going to push the narrative that since you're exactly the same, you don't need benefits, you don't need reservations. The problem with all of this is that even within Hindus, there's lots of differences in terms of what these people actually need and the problems that they actually face. There's not a uniformity even in the problems of a specific community, i.e. it's unclear how these benefits necessarily stand. There are huge differences in terms of the problems that these people face. If this is all brushed to the side in Gov's world, if you don't establish that the difference is real, and that's what you do on the comparative in ops world, but you lose out on in Gov's world, then at that point of time, you never necessarily try to solve the problems in the first place. That's the comparative Gov has to deal with. But in terms of interactions, right, they say you can like talk with majorities about your lived experiences. When you conform to the norms this way, you're effectively giving up on telling the actual stories that you grew up with, because you're trying to conform to the norms, you're telling them I'm just like you. That means you're inherently editing out your lived experiences and telling them in a way that's palatable to majoritarian communities. I'm not sure why this is a good interaction. Like, I'm not sure why that's even a benefit. Interaction itself isn't good. You have to prove that that actually causes some sort of change, gets people to buy into your narratives, gets them to actually look into your problems. If you're editing out those problems, it's unlikely that you ever get change. But just on conformity in general, right? You may say you are the same culturally, but there is still an inherent difference that exists between these people. And the reasoning for that is the structural reasoning I gave you at the start of this speech. The generational wealth, the huge economic disparity between these groups, the fact that they've had to overcome hugely different barriers in order to get to the point which they are at right now, means that even if you try to be culturally the same, there's still huge inherent differences that you have to deal with. It's unclear how this ever happens on their side of the house. So, what do these communities necessarily then value? It's necessarily the identity that they're associated with. i.e., a very large chunk of the time, due to these reasons, these people lack basic resources. It's difficult for them to reach much happiness or like get happiness out of life. If this is the case, and if these barriers are real, then at that point of time, your identity is something you can take comfort to. It's something that you aren't forced to change in their world. And note, this is like very, very crucial. In order for the side to actually get change, even members of the community are forced to conform. Otherwise, it's pretty obvious to majoritarian communities, this is just a farce that they're putting on in order to like show that maybe we are the same, but if the whole community isn't acting that way, no one's gonna buy that, you're never necessarily gonna get that change. So here's the trade-off you have to deal with. These people lose out on the inherent value of their culture and the belief on this trade. This is a huge burden on people, but they're forced to give this stuff up without the guarantee of a good return, because it's not likely that you're going to beat the system every single time. If Gov can't definitively prove that this works in bringing change all the time, this likelihood analysis illustrates why a world in which this trade-off is forced upon these people, i.e. Gov's world, is inherently a world that is more problematic than the comparative. I'll link all this back to outcomes towards the end of my speech. So there's going to be 4 pushes that you get from opposition in this round. Number 1, in terms of politics and distinctiveness, you can cater to more diverse groups at a point of time which you address, at which you appeal to the distinctive nature. Why? You can create awareness in the way you want, in ways that your community can actually relate to, in terms of you can address specific needs and be like, hey, we know that culturally these problems have arisen in the past, that's why we'll look into them. You appeal, i.e. the Congress party appeals to Muslim groups in terms of how the distinctive nature of their culture is why you should vote for us, because we're actually looking out for your culture. When you're forced to conform, this looks like the BJP and BJP telling Muslims, hey, you have to act like us, you have to act like us. It puts a large chunk of pressure on people. And note, this is how you get liberal people to care. You attract empathy, and it's not just your disadvantaged group that you're talking about here, right? You unite multiple groups who are othered by society. So you get solidarity from all of these communities. When you conform to the norm, this solidarity is lost because it's unclear what the actual issues are that you're trying to deal with in the first place. I don't see why that's a benefit. Politics inherently becomes better on our side of the house. Secondly, in terms of utility people, right? You come out when you show that you can offer a distinct trait, or your culture has a distinct or different value, you come off as someone who has a different value to society as compared to someone who just conforms with the norm. I.e., it comes off like you can contribute to society in different ways because of the lived experiences that you have, because you've been maybe brought up in a different way, and because of that you have a slightly different skill set compared to people. This is something you can show off in a more effective way. Why is this important? You let people get a seat at the table in terms of discussions when they actually show they have something to offer. By conforming to the norm, you aren't necessarily bringing something new or valuable, and that's why majoritarian communities won't necessarily care about the fact that you're conforming, because they're like, okay, cool, you're conforming, but if you're not adding any benefit, I'm unclear why that's a good thing in and of itself. What is the trade-off? You just don't come off as someone who can bring something new. You don't come off as someone who is inherently valuable, and that is something these people have to do in order to get society to recognize them. Otherwise, society is just going to keep disregarding them. The third thing I want to talk about then is in terms of discourse. Note, we get more polarizing narratives on our side of the house, and that's probably true. But why is this more likely in terms of getting discourse in the first place than on the comparative? Conforming basically means you end up following the majoritarian values. You have discourse when you hear diversity of opinions. Else you just have echo chambers, i.e. having a debate like this only makes sense because both Gov and Op are presenting different cases. If we decide to conform to one idea, it's not even a debate in the first place, right? So the first metric here is probability. It's comparatively greater that you have discourse in the first place. But that itself is not important. If we don't show the discourse is likely to be good, then the discourse isn't really a benefit. The thing is that it comes off when you come off as someone who is being true to yourself. You can actually highlight the distinct values that you bring to the table in terms of discourse. You can highlight explicit differences, and that forces people to engage with you. The forcing part is extremely, extremely important because you never get that on their side. I don't know why just conforming to a norm means that other people are going to be willing to engage with discourse with you in the first place, or actually have discourse that is good in any way, and that's the comparative Gov necessarily has to deal with. But the last thing I want to talk about is just the community reacting negatively, right? This is going to be implemented by leaders. It looks like a loss of your identity inherently. If distinctiveness doesn't work out and you don't necessarily get the benefits, i.e. that might happen, right? Because it's very, very difficult to break these structural barriers. It's not going to happen every single time. What happens in Gov's world is that it looks like the community has inherently given up on what it values, given up on its inherent ideology, and that is something they have to stick to. Otherwise, it looks like they're just fluctuating from here to there and not necessarily having any set term values in terms of what they actually want to push for. What's the weighing? It's unlikely these movements work most of the time. The reasoning behind this is the structural reasons I give you. What is the last thing to consider then? It's about happiness versus sadness, right? You get mental solace in the fact that, okay, even if the movement didn't work out very, very well, at least I'm staying true to myself. At least I can talk about my culture with people who appreciate it, and at least I can be very, very happy with myself. This is only possible in Ops world. Gov doesn't have it. Proud to oppose.
Cool. Hi, obviously I'm audible, wait, okay. So before I start my speech, the best thing is that I'm debating with all of my friends in all houses, so that's great. And the second thing is that Lavanya, you have been awesome and we've worked really hard to get here. Great. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Direct responses. Firstly, differentiation leads to things like quotas, etc., right? 5 structural reasons this does not happen. A, there is a difference between whether you are naturally different or whether your strategy to put this differentiation forward to begin with, right? Because you naturally may be different and that's something which may be like common knowledge to begin with, but the way you strategize, the way you tell it to people that these things are common is something which you can actually do. Number 2, when you argue for things, you mostly use things like how you're at a disadvantaged situation when you argue for things like reservation. It's not that you're not talking about how your cultural practices are different. This means the fact that you had faced a lot of problems in the past and you used arguments such as reparations, these things don't align with things like you being culturally different. This means you can do it anyways. But structural reason number 3, social movements don't operate on a single strategy. What this means is they apply in different, social movements operate in different avenues. They apply strategy 1 here, they apply strategy 2 here. What this uniquely means is when you're campaigning on public, when you're campaigning in social media, you're likely going to use this strategy of commonality. Except when you're using in backdoor lobbying with governments, you can use this thing that, okay, because we have been oppressed, therefore we want reservation. You never prove the exclusivity of you actually getting that reservation, primarily because social movements use this as a strategic way to apply the strategy in different things. But fourthly, quotas are unlikely going to get reversed because of massive backlash that they're going to get to the current government in power, primarily because every government has re-election incentives. Therefore, even if you say, people will say, okay, remove their quotas, this thing never actually comes into construction. But fifthly, what's the comparative? On a comparative, you also never prove whether you're likely going to get more quotas in the future. In so you're not going to get more quotas in the future. Therefore, I'm unsure in regards to when and where are you going to use this argument and whether it's actually going to lead you to more benefits in the very first to begin, right? Point number 2, cultural invisibilization. A lot of responses to this, I don't know whether they ran it well, maybe Angad Sai ran it. A, often cultural practices are done in close-knit communities, like you're going to worship in a place which you can anyways do primarily because it's mostly members of your own community. 2, for most people, culture is a personal connection. This means you probably prioritize your beliefs and your personal connection to your culture rather than you actually promoting it in the public. But number 3, oftentimes this strategy is targeted towards the majoritarian people, meaning in social media, meaning in campaigns, meaning in workplace, etc., right? This means a lot of our cultural practices is anyways going to happen. You never talk about the reality. But fourthly, in a worst case, even if some degree of cultural invisibilization is happening, why the trade-off is okay? Number 1, in a homophobic state, people lie about their sexuality because it's a right to their self-defense. Because to defend oneself, you actually have to lie about your sexuality primarily because you don't want to be killed. Use the same analogy and apply here. Primarily because you want people to actually talk to you. You don't want a lot of social backlash. This uniquely means that you are unlikely, that this probably wouldn't affect you so much insofar as you reach the benefits that we actually claim. But number 2, you can limit your access to culture for a larger benefit primarily because Lavanya exclusive proves to you how there is some degree of conformity in regards to people actually like seeing that comment and actually trying to connect to you in the very first to begin with, right? But lastly, why is the strategy effective, right? A, social discourse regarding things like discrimination are on a rise. NGOs coming up in colleges, you having awareness campaigns in colleges that are coming up with different societies. But number 2, narratives change the way you think, right? Because when you interact with different narratives, what is religion? Religion is a narrative. It indoctrinates you. Whenever you constantly see this strategy, when you see that these people, there is something different, this actually has a potential for you to actually think differently, right? Because you have ingrained biases, Angad is right, except you have an ability to challenge those ingrained biases because Lavanya's mechanism actually explained to you how how you can cognitively conceptualize this and how this is like a contradiction in your mind because your parents told you stay away from the black child, but now you're able to see that the black child is just like you and is just like another human being like you. This commonality actually leads for you to actually get more cohesive with that particular person, POSI. None of that works if you don't actually use this argument of conformity. I'll get to that. Lastly, on empathy, on regards to O, let's take them out. Firstly, if you're using empathy for general people on the ground, A, they never put the incentive structure for people to actually get that empathetic, primarily because the fact that people see LGBTQ people as different is primarily because, and they're discriminated because they see them as different. They see that we don't share any commonality. This commonality is the tipping point for you to actually think about these people, because to think is the very first step for you to get any kind of change. But number two, you show distinctiveness, right? And when you show distinctiveness, this means you mentally think about more distinct features. When I say I'm distinct from you, the oppressor will think about more distinct features. This means because of this selfish interest, they're likely going to prioritize those things which cater to the self-interest, the negative things, your primitive cultural practices, the narratives which actually tell you that you are inferior. These things are actually important in this debate to begin with. But lastly, your idea is that Sai says there are other alternatives. Why is pandering the only way, therefore proving uniqueness? A, society's functional utilitarianism. We live in a world where ideas of majority supersedes everything. In politics, 51% of people get to live with the party that they want, and other 49% of the people are actually fucked up. But number two, power structures are controlled by majority people. All you need is an attempt to fight this ideology that you are actually inferior. But three, what do people care about the most? And this is the vain part, right? A, like the people feeling bad because they're pandering to their oppressor is nothing. People trying to smile and talking about commonality, even if they hate the other person, is nothing. What is something and what people care about is ability to communicate, ability to walk on the road, ability to not be boycotted by other people, ability to get those opportunities, ability to actually not feel uncomfortable, not see that you are different because you're a black person, to think that both of us have some commonality, that both of us are American. Why is this true? Vain. A, right to life has no independent value, but it's right to a dignified life. Intuition pump. Think that euthanasia are coming up because you don't see life has an independent value. You have arguments like anti-natalism, primarily because right to dignified life is a priori. Right? Point number two, if people treat you better, it makes you happier. And we want happy people, simple. But three, long term. What's the time? 6, long term. Even if you deprioritize some parts about a culture, your right to a dignified life precedes your right to want to talk about a culture, primarily because people have different kind of intersectionalities. Or realistically speaking, a person has a cultural identity, a person has a religious identity. We think you have an ability to prioritize different things in different circumstances, because the comparative is worse. The comparative is you actually not having any commonality. Because see, even if CO comes up here and proves that you can smartly use this idea of differentiation, even if you're showing some different things which majority of people are going to like, the problem with this is that when you show yourself as different, they also think about other things that are different, your gender, your caste, and this means that they're likely going to prioritize the self-interest, they're likely going to discriminate you. What matters in this debate is people's ability to live, is people's ability to have that cohesion. And Lavanya exclusively proves to you why you actually using this strategy becomes a tipping point for people to actually get cohesive view in regards to things like why do people care about these, etc., etc. Lastly, we get buy-in, we get ideological conformity. It's very difficult to fight indoctrination, but every attempt is worth it because people want to live. Very proud to stand in opening government. Thank you.
Before I start, the first debate video I ever watched was NALSAR 2016, where it was the last time VIT won NALSAR. I don't know after 6 years if I can get the trophy home, but I'm still proud of where I am. So yeah. All right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I don't want a black kid to be treated as a white kid because I want that teacher to know that the black kid doesn't get private tuitions. I want that teacher to know that his parents are probably not educated for them to probably teach that black kid, and that's why he probably has poorer grades, and probably convince him to not drop out of college because of this repression. I want those people to acknowledge that he is different, and that is why I probably help him more to know that he's probably getting bad grades because he cannot be taught at home. He's probably getting bad grades because his dad doesn't come to home because of the fact that he works as a laborer, because of the fact that he's a minority. What is our case here? We tell you that the positive change which Robin and Lavanya necessarily want to talk about is not important in this debate. Multiple reasons for this. When the moment you say that Dalits are Hindus, you disregard the amount of history of oppression Dalits have faced. Why this is tremendously crucial? Because it's tremendously crucial to acknowledge for any kind of change Dalits wants to fight for. If they want to fight for quotas, the way they have to justify these quotas is by telling people that we do not have generational wealth, we do not have houses in which we could have sold them for to get more money, and we have been discriminated, and that is why we don't have money, and that is why we live in poorer families right now, and that's exactly why we are much better worse off. The reason why people cannot acknowledge that in their paradigm is because they do not acknowledge that history. You cannot do both of the things. At the same point of time, you cannot say that you are a Hindu, but at the same point of time, you can say that, but we are Hindu, but with a different history. There are some tweaks, there are some nuances here. At that point of time, you cannot really do what they really want to have that paradigm. Secondly, and more importantly, conservatives call you out. It's extremely hard for distinctiveness to be called out, right? You can just necessarily say that, hey, I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community, and that's absolutely okay. You cannot necessarily call that out and ask people why exactly are you different. But you can call that out in conformity, right? But at the point of which Dalits necessarily say that they are part of the Hindu community, extreme conservatives necessarily question that. They say that, hey, but you are not as similar to Brahmin, and that is why you probably do not deserve rights, and that is why your campaign is absolutely farcical. We think at that point of paradigm, you necessarily stop the amount of social change they necessarily want to argue about. But thirdly and more importantly, even if this kind of change they kind of get, I am extremely unsure what this change looks like, right? I do not know how this can be things like quotas or things like reservations for this kind of policy or things like affirmative action at the point of which you cannot acknowledge the fact that these people are extremely different. At the point of which you do not do that, you cannot change these kind of things for these kind of people. But fourthly and more importantly, right, what about minorities inside minorities? The things like black women who necessarily have to conform to things like what white women feel or what their problems looks like. Prioritization of things like workplace harassment more than prioritization of things like living in poorer neighborhoods where harassment is more crucial. You cannot fight for these nuances and ask for what you exactly want because you have to conform to a majoritarian narrative. The moment you do that, your most vulnerable stakeholders are extremely at a poorer state because they cannot ask for what exactly they want, because they cannot ask for the nuances of the problem they are necessarily facing. For all of those reasons, you do not get the change you want to fight for. How do we get change then? And this is tremendously important, right? You at a point of which you are distinct, you become a single issue voter. This is tremendously important. The moment you do that, you are necessarily a part of minority and there is someone who wants to cater to you in a democracy. Why this is absolutely crucial, right? The reason why Congress necessarily caters to more Muslim people right now is simply because of the fact that they realize that it's a tipping point of propaganda, which is to say people know that what BJP is doing and they can necessarily sell the idea of democracy by using Muslims. The reason why this is tremendously crucial because they realize the distinctiveness of the fact of the policies they generally want. If these people would have conformed to majoritarian ideologies, they would not have been able to differentiate themselves. Why this is tremendously crucial? Because in our paradigm, they are able to differentiate themselves and find political parties for themselves who want to cater to this particular sort of voter bank. If they want to do that, at our very worst, at our very best case, we get these changes minutely when these people come to power, at least in some constituencies in MLAs, but also more importantly, at our worst case, this gets discussed in the assembly. This is the bare minimum, which is already more what OG and CG can probably give you. But before that, POI, CG. OG, yeah, go.
Policy change is contingent on 100 factors, but using conformity is a direct way for a particular person to get that ideological information engaged.
Yes, sure, you can get the adequate confirmation, but do you really want it? I can agree with the fact that like USA that the single issue voting could be about like Afghanistan war, but I'm extremely unsure why a black person needs to idealize that. Probably his priority is about gerrymandering. He cannot make that differentiating claim at a point of which he's catering to the majority. That is the difference here. So even if you're catering to the majority, you cannot get what you exactly want. Secondly, in terms of empathy, right? I think Soumitra already talks about it. You can necessarily cater to people and tell what exactly your problems were, and they will probably have a heart and listen to you. This is an extremely hard make to prove, but more importantly, the only thing which goes past rationality is your idea of emotional quotient. The reason why people donate money, even though it's a zero-sum game where you are losing money and it's going to something else, is because people think that they have done a nice thing and that gives them net utility happiness. We think at that point of time, when you necessarily cater to these kind of people, when you go and support BLM movements and probably donate to them, when you try to support a legislation for them, you get net utility happiness the way you get through similar things when you do things like altruism. POI. The conformity is about catering conform to the majority. Even if there is intersectionality of the problems prioritization is on a relative basis. I can care both about Afghanistan and gerrymandering, but gerrymandering is probably more worse off for me. I think the prioritization is still there. Then, why do we think that empathy would still work, right? Because of the fact that people are altruistic in nature, because they necessarily want to do nice things for people and feel great about themselves. This is the savior trope argument we necessarily want to talk about. We think that also works. The reasoning is really simple. There are multiple mechs in which we can get change, but even if these mechs are extremely slow in our paradigm, that's absolutely okay, because the majority of the minute changes we get is exactly what these communities want. Things like quotas, things like affirmative actions and so on. I think at that point of paradigm, the change we get is net positive on their paradigm, because the change they get is irrelevant to those kind of people. What do I mean by acceptance then? We think that people think in terms of what adds more value to their society, right? Which is to say, people want sometimes to have migrants, for example, in countries like Japan, because Japan has a lesser workplace forces. We think at that point of paradigm, they want more migrants because they can give them jobs and they can necessarily work for them. Why this is tremendously crucial? Distinctiveness tells you that you can add something new. When 1998 France won the World Cup, it was a lot of majority black people who necessarily played for France, and that is where the acceptance rates for racism rates dropped by 40%. The reason is this, that they necessarily thought that black people can play better football and they can win World Cups for them. This distinctiveness itself shows people that they can add value to it, and people give value to that utility as well. Insofar that's true, this distinctiveness allows you to look different, and that is why people have more acceptance towards you. Panel, we think that conformity is something which is farcical in its nature. At a point of which you do not get the change you want. We get the change we want. Tremendously proud to oppose, I guess.
All right, okay, assuming this is audible. All right, POIs from opening opposition, 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Don't verbally interrupt. I mean, I don't think you can, but I mean, I'll take you. All right, just a quick anecdote before I begin. I was also there at NALSAR in 2019, and I was watching the final somewhere from up there in the stands. It feels incredibly overwhelming to come back 3 years later and do this from right here. All right, with that being said, 3, 2, One, firstly, framing. I'm not sure what this distinctiveness actually looks like from opening opposition, because in the absence of this, if you can portray that this distinctiveness is going to be portrayed in a negative manner, that does not activate the benefits that opening opposition talks about, because the entirety of the case is contingent on the premise that this distinctiveness is likely to be portrayed in a positive manner, activating benefits of empathy, quota, reservations, and all of that, which does not simply happen. How does this distinctiveness likely to be portrayed? One, it literally spills the us versus them narrative, because as I can say, if you literally want to get radical change, as CEO points out, or even if opening opposition points out that you literally have to create this extreme premise, which is at that point of time, you're likely to be portrayed as something that's fundamentally different in terms of from the majoritarian identity. Secondly, in terms of your cultures and practices being essentially different. Say for example, in terms of food habits, when they literally propagated for having halal meat on the stands compared to like normal meat that you can essentially purchase, which means at that point of time, the distinctiveness that you need to, or also like in terms of radical political parties that O talks about, which means at that point of time, this is the kind of distinctiveness that's likely to pan out. Why is this likely to be portrayed in a negative manner by the media and largely then what you call interpreted by people negatively? Few things here under this. Firstly, I think for politicians and largely majoritarian groups in general, this gives you greater amount of fodder for radical messaging to essentially exist. First thing also in terms of framing existing, I think this debate has to take place in a system that is largely centrist in the first place, because it cannot be extremely right-wing for like no change can essentially happen, or extremely liberal for that I don't think the motion can exist. Which means considering that the political system is largely centrist in nature, the debate is largely about where the political spectrum shifts once this strategy comes into perspective in the first place to begin with. Or after this, on this, I think there are four things under this. One, I think given the fact that identity is the lowest common denominator that politicians can use to win elections, I think point at which they have an active fodder when you go ahead and create this us versus them narrative, they can literally utilize this to create these distinctions and literally isolate voter blocks to ensure that they hit that 51% level in the first place. Secondly, the very fact that media has the essential reason to sensationalize things. That is to say, when you have political parties that are extremely radical and go ahead and make radical comments against majority communities in the first place, or say for example, radical messaging or practices that you essentially go ahead and embodify, this gives more amount of media to sensationalize this content, creating more amount of political fodder for these individuals to more leverage and capitalize on. Note, this is not symmetric simply because this this increases incredibly high simply because you literally give them fuel to the fire, which this doesn't happen because they don't have this N+1 narrative on their side of the house to go ahead and like literally push the vitriol against you. This literally looks like France, when literally the minority community went ahead and adopted distinctive measures that literally shifted the political spectrum from the center to the center, right? In which now you only have center-right and far-right political parties operating in France. I think that's literally detrimental in the first place to begin with. With that being said, we told you why this is likely to be done in a negative way, which means it's like more likely to be divisive, vitriolic, and you're not likely to get moderate support. That's the reason why it does not happen. I don't think opening government does that in the first place. They directly jump to impacts. First extension then, utility of culture. First thing to say under this is, opening opposition never proves why the culture is the most important part of your intersectional identity. People can have competing interests in terms of economic needs that they want. Like the reason you want to get, say, catharsis from a job, or say, for example, the football match that you want to watch with your friends. Why is identity the most important thing to access that comfort is something that opening opposition doesn't prove. What does the utility of culture tell you? I think it tells us that if culture does not essentially have a utility in the first place to begin with, it's okay for us to let go of that culture if we can get tangibly better benefits out of it. Why is this more realistic to happen? Few things under this. One, most of the world right now is capitalistic in the first place to begin with like in most Western countries across the world, also countries in South Asia, also countries like China. I don't think apart from Cuba, any country apparently is socialist, which means individuals in society largely haywire their needs in terms of, say, for example, a better job that they want, or moving up the social ladder, or essentially getting promotions, or ensuring that they have economic sustainability and economic independence. This is the thing that is largely likely to be prevalent. Why is then your culture an active deterrent for you to access this social mobility in the first place? The reason for this is pretty simple. I think few things under this. Point at which when you actively portray your identity as something that's being different, firstly, you're more likely to, say, for example, face subconscious and conscious biases from people that you work, that in your workplace, or say, for example, people in school, or people that you interact with. Because we told you why media has an incentive to portray this in a negative manner. And of course, most of the media in the majority of the world are owned by big businessmen, the Rupert Murdoch talks, or say the Republican part like Fox News, etc., or the BJP going and funding certain news outlets. Which means at that point of time, considering majority groups control media outlets, that essentially has that incentive on media to portray this on a negative light in the majoritarian interest. Which means at that point of time, that leads to brainwashing of people to, or say for example, people like altering their biases in a way against these communities in the first place. This leads to more amount of say things like microaggressions in workplaces. You like facing social isolation and not having a group of friends to chill with in like post-work hours. I think at that point of time, you're less motivated as an individual to opt into these circles. You're less motivated as a minority to opt into these economic systems. Also, this means that there is also active incentive for them to essentially discriminate against you. You do away with this when you essentially opt into conformity, because at this point of time, there is no other distinguishing marker that essentially exists for these individuals or having an active fuel to go ahead and discriminate against you. This is important because at this point of time, you're far easier to reach things like, say for example, having a better community, or say or interacting with more people largely in general, because it's very difficult to coalesce within same identity markers. You might not have that same identity community in your vicinity in the first place, in the workplace, which is much more likely to face things like isolation. I think at that point of time, when culture has comparatively less utility in the present world. Okay, before I move on, yes, go ahead. Got it. I got it. This cannot operate in an extreme case of extreme xenophobes. This has to be moderates and centrist political systems where they're likely to shift. No debate happens if it's absolutely on the extreme end. Why is then it's much more likely to be beneficial? Which means at that point of time, when your culture is actively creating a deterrence against your social and upward mobility, I think at that point of time, it becomes way more detrimental. I think contact theory essentially states that point at which when you're much more likely not to subconsciously or consciously alienate individuals, talk about commonalities such as nationality, or say for example, say common celebrations or events that you essentially have, or like bursting firecrackers during Diwali. I think at that point of time, you're much more likely to have a greater sense of people that you can talk to, more amount of support networks that you can reach out to, more amount of individuals that are likely to listen to you, more friends that you can create. The last metric that you need to consider in this round is where is it easier for the individual to access happiness. This is most important, because for you to fight with your identity, create radical change, get incremental progress, create quotas, which I don't think you're going to get moderate support for the same, is way more difficult. You're much more likely to access happiness on our side of the house by, say for example, creating better community, like more communities, having more people talk to you and not isolate and alienate you, and essentially having a better network and friend circle that you can get common points of happiness from. I think at that point of time, it's easier for those individuals to access happiness than the radical incremental change. Insanely proud to propose.
One second. Hi, is this audible? Is this good? Cool. Just one corny bit. I'd just like to thank a handful of people. I think the majority of them are sitting in the first seat, without whom I'd not be standing here. People who have driven me, people who have inspired me, and people who have helped me. And most importantly, people who have believed me. Angad, Vansh, all the juniors. And Pranjal, of course, she's not there, but yeah.
If you don't fight for yourself, no one will. 3 pieces of extension in this page, the most important being the reparative obligation that we owe to these individuals is something now that the majorities are absolved of. Why is that incredibly bad? Why the comparative is good? All of that. But before that, I quickly want to wash away opening half from the debate. I'll do this in 3 ways. But firstly, I want to quickly talk about a piece of setup. Firstly, conformity also situates your identity at a particular step of the social ladder. So that just means like deciding like the dominant culture that you're conforming to decides where you step in, like where you place in terms of what occupations are permissible for you, what kind of ideas you can have, what kind of places you can visit, and what not. Why is this incredibly important? Because of the kind of hold that these narratives have had through generations and generations. You are a new entrant into this realm. That means you cannot ever decide the kind of place that you hold. But what is the comparative? Distinctiveness means that you are able to dictate these levers at any given point of time, where you place on these metrics. That means in like just right off the bat, there is more like freedom to begin with. But secondly, panel, I think opening is entirely a wash, but if that metric still exists and is important, we'll win that. Why is opening a wash? Robin, in their speech, concede that society progress is utilitarian and only can be perceived through that lens. Let us understand that people in any kind of minority or majority exist on a spectrum. Considering we are talking about minorities, different people have been affected by different variables, externalities, and the positive effects of social justice movements. That means everyone has a subjective view of progress. Some people want social rights, political rights, legal rights, land rights, economic rights. We cannot ascertain what majority of stakeholders want at any given point of time. If you are not able to ascertain what majority of people want, I don't even know what opening half is talking about to begin with. No metric to prioritize where you are going, what you want to begin with. That means opening half is extremely uncertain at the end of the debate because there is no set metric that they want to fight on. But even if opening is a metric in this debate, why do we win? One crucial piece of weighing. Panel, when you conform, there is no going back. There is absolutely no opt-out of this permanent alteration to your identity that you make at any given point of time. This never cannot, like, this can't ever be like resolved, or this cannot ever be reversed. Why is this true? Because the drivers of change get dissolved in the first place. Social justice movements or anything that fought like for good things for you are made up of people like from the grassroots of this movement. If that critical mass is something, or like people start like opting out of this thing in the first place, all of the progress will be undone. That means there is nothing left to go back to, like at the point of time you enter this contract of conformity to begin with. Why is this the weighing metric that you should like use on opening to give us the debate? Because this is a long-term harm that is compounded to eternity, because the opt-in never exists. Like Devan has to prove in their speech why some kind of opt-out like could be conceptualized, but we think that's an extremely high threshold, and for that reason, opening is out. And even if they're not out, that metric is ours. What is our extension? One simple piece of extension. We think reparative obligation that the majority owes to the minority is something that they do away with. They rid themselves of it. They absolve themselves of it. How are we unique from DLO? Like it came in DLO. O's idea is that you push your problems under the rug, and that means you cannot afford it recognition, and that's bad. We don't think that's the likely interpretation. On CO, we tell you what's the likely interpretation. Likely interpretation is that minority are either over the historical trauma, have made peace with it for reasons of like, being compensated ably by being given welfare housing, by doing like certain goods over, like being like done certain goods to them by like over the centuries, some like goodness and all of that. Or secondly, they just have given up on the high threshold that they want to have. Why is this interpretation so likely? 2 reasons. Firstly, we think whenever you enter a new, whenever you confirm, we think there's going to be media discourse around it. This is something that CG also argues. When there is media discourse, it's always going to be driven top down. It's never bottom up. So you never really listen to the reasons as to why people started conforming to the majority culture to begin with. You only hear reasons from the top up as to why the likely reasons could have been, and those likely reasons are, just going to be conservative in nature because that's what fits their narrative at any given point of time. If that is the negative interpretation that's likely, why is this especially bad? We think this is especially bad because future generations are able to escape the guilt, and that just erases this bit of trauma from public consciousness. What is this piece of trauma that's especially important? Because there's a lot of historical context to any minority-majority struggle. We think the dichotomy that you're currently placed in, having to choose between conforming and not conforming, like staying in minority, even that existence of that dichotomy is something that's inherently or crucially bad, because they have led you to such circumstances that you are having to decide between something like this. This is especially bad because after this generation, there's something that completely goes away, this consciousness or whatever it is. Why is the existence of a reparative obligation good? Why am I talking about the existence and not what happens after? Because I recognize on opening that it might be extremely difficult to ascertain what happens as a consequence of that reparative obligation. So I'll talk about the existence of that obligation in the first place. The existence of the obligation does one very good thing. It makes you derive utility in your identity. O also said this, but O's context is in the present. Robin correctly challenges this when they talk about the dire circumstances that these people find themselves in. If that's the circumstances people find themselves in, what else can identity be utile for? Historical context to begin with. That's why reparative obligations are important. Before the certain kind of trauma or agony was inflicted upon you, you were so great. You had a good identity. You had something valuable to latch onto, and that's what we want to fight for. CG. Yeah, welfare schemes can only exist when the scale, permissible scale for them to exist exists. Like when a large amount of people opt out, it no longer is an electoral issue, so you have only a handful of them, so the delta reduces. Cool. Why the existence is good? This derivation of utility from history is especially important because that's the only kind of value in identity or culture you can ever find. Why? One simple weighing metric. We think coverage and scale. On coverage, we think everyone has some kind of history to look back to because everyone in the current conditions are facing certain kind of challenges. That's why Robin's response to O stands, but Robin does not have any response to us. Secondly, we think on scale, it's protected. On scale, we think just everyone is affected by it at any given point of time to begin with. But lastly, just one response to Rito so that Deban doesn't say that I didn't engage. Commonality between people. I think the idea from the POI still remains. There are some preceding indicators or some proximity bias. There's just a cognitive bias that people are born with at any given point of time. There's 20 years of conditioning into your racism or some kind of cognitive bias that you might have, which might make you go ahead and accommodate people from your same skin color, people with similar dialects, or it's as subliminal as this to begin with. When things are as subliminal as this to begin with, I don't really see how common this ground, how is this common ground even established when there is no likelihood of this common ground being established, and when the commonality is so subliminal, I think their changes are also redundant.
Yep, so before I start, just want to say a few things. NALSAR is a competition I've always looked up to. Knowing the quality and the kind of people that have been in this tournament over the years has been a huge inspiration for me. Thanks to Rito for carrying me in this tournament so far. Thanks to all my friends sitting in the first row who've been with me this entire time and through other tournaments. Couldn't have been happened without you. Cool, with that being said, starting in 3, 2, 1. First, I want to be very clear about what our extension is in this round. What we proved to you uniquely is first, we tell you that there's incentives that politicians have in order to exacerbate the issue and make it a lot worse. This is because of the reason that people buy this is with the fact that they have cognitive biases that allow them to opt into all of these things. So things like us versus them biases, things like flight or fight mechanisms mean that politicians are able to capitalize on this and push this via media incentives and inflame the issue to a very significant extent. I think this is extremely important in our side of the world to actually actualize change that exists. Number one, this is because of the fact that you actually actually push, like you actually like just reduce the amount of enthusiasm that moderates have for change on their side of the world. Because note, this debate necessarily has to happen in a society like France, where you have some amount of centrism within political discourse, and you can effectuate some change by the actions that you continue to have. If you don't have that, and if you just have like right wings completely as O wants to prioritize, that the entire debate just turns out to be a wash, and there's actually nothing that happens in the round. But when this happens though, is that you can turn on, you can like allow moderates, and you can actually allow the actualized moderates to cause change on your side of the house. The reason that this is true is because you don't have explicit identity markers and actually go for conformity that exists within the media. It's because of the fact that the media does this though, and if you have identity markers that exist, all of those differences are amplified to an extremely large extent, and they like on scale just reduce the amount of change you're likely to get. But second, even if you don't buy the social change impact from either side, what we proved to you uniquely is that it's much easier for you to access happiness on our side of the house. Why is this true? Because note, op case is just saying things like you have things like quotas, you have things like radical change, you have all of these things that change that O wants to push. But note, these things are extremely symmetric because of the fact that majorities still have incentives to reduce the amount of benefits that minorities tend to get. This looks like for reservation, for instance, people like majorities in India are still saying that, oh, everyone's formally equal anyway, they all have 24 hours in a day, why can't they just study? All of those discourses still exist on their side, and therefore the change that they get is very marginal. We get you a much easier way to access the happiness that individuals get, because we actually give you a sense, because you have less vitriol that you face on a daily basis. If you have a conversation with your immediate work, but like the person who's sitting next to you at work, you actually have good conversations with them without feeling alienated and without feeling completely abandoned that exists, which means it's much greater for us in order to just like win. Before I go on to like top half and just wash that out, let's deal with CO's extension. CO's main push is to say that there is an obligation that exists. Number one, as I asked them in a POI, I think that obligation might reduce to some extent if they want to say that there is like these cultures and these welfare schemes that exist. I'm not sure like how much welfare you actually need to make their obligation disappear. I think there's a tension in that case generally. Second, I don't think they can ever fulfill that obligation on their side of the house without proving social change that exists. So that principle is still contingent on proving the social change that we want to talk to you about. We uniquely tell you we get on our side of the house. But finally, just note the fact that even if you just like, minorities are likely to be deprioritized on their side of the house as well, right? This is because of uniquely the incentive that we give you in terms of the way that media narratives generally work. That is to say, even if you owe a reparative obligation, the fact that there's a media narrative that exists to push against this obligation, to push against minorities and villainize minorities, will still exist on their side of the house. The reason this is not symmetric though, is because of the fact that you have unique levers and unique tools that apply in these countries. It's because of the fact that these things are the baseline for a lot of people. I.e., if you talk about basic differences that people can visualize, and if you have subconscious biases that opt into them, and that just like influence all of your thoughts and interactions to a very significant extent, which means it's likely to push things towards like from the center to the center, right? And make a larger number of people and antagonistic towards minorities that you get on the comparative, which means they're likely to then prove social change generally. All right then, let's just go with like the main clash that exists in terms of what we give to you and like what O gives to you, right? Because note, O's frame is extremely extreme, where they say that, okay, like there are right-wing people who just do a large amount of backlash. There's one thing I want to note here. O says majorities are biased and therefore they will not change, but they also say that these people have basic empathy, which means they're likely to be really nice towards minorities. Those are in tension, just choose which one and then like just choose what you actually want to argue in. But second, O has this idea of value addition within the media that currently exists, except that this is just not true because of the fact that minorities are actively villainized by the media. Note, O never mechanizes what this looks like on their side of the house, right? If you have these people coming out in public discourse, they're likely to be villainized uniquely because of what Rito tells you in extension. The fact that these people are portrayed as portrayed as people who are not equal to the majority in a vast number of cases, amplified by media narratives that continue to exist. But no, but I'm just like, okay. Second thing, just like on the idea of identity and why I think that's just not important. Number one, know that this value addition that they get is extremely temporary. DLO talks about football. What happens when black football players miss important goals is they face an extremely large amount of racism and vitriol. That literally what happened to Drogba, that literally what's happened to Pogba when they miss important goals in important matches, that what happened to Euro finals when there was like days and days of racism against minority players who miss these goals. What we give you on our side of the house though, is we give these people some amount of certainty. We give these people the certainty in their immediate life and their immediate proximate context to say that if you interact with someone without wearing that identity marker, you're unlikely to be subconsciously biased against them. You're likely to have some level of quality interaction that doesn't exist on their side of the house at the fundamental individual level. Okay. Secondly, let's just deal with the idea of political action from O. I think we already tell you that why the political action is a lot better on our side of the house by giving you actual harm. So O just says that, okay, there's going to be no change on their side of the house. But except we give you impacts of why there's change. Number one, we tell you that there's like banning of culture and things like that that exist. If you look at France, for instance, the fact that France moved towards the right, means that you had bans on things like burqas on their side of the house and identity markers that were probably important individuals. Secondly, you had attacks on things like minorities. So even a country like Sweden, for example, had active hate crimes and active hate attacks against minorities because of the fact that the country that was either ways like just fairly liberal moved to the right because of the fact that you had open identity markers that currently existed and you didn't try to find relatability with majority norms that exist. All of these outweigh the kind of like benefits that O wants to talk about because they never actually prove social change on their side of the house at all. Before I go on, sure. Yeah, we prove you the tipping point, right? Because if these are fairly central systems, you can say things that actually change the way that people are influenced. So if you give them non-identity markers, what this means is they're more likely to take you at face value as opposed to subconsciously treating you negatively because you have identity markers that don't conform to the values and the cultures they've taught. What this means is that a shift in the overturn window, which means that if you shift some people to the center left, for example, and become more accepting of you, that shifts the political discourse and the political conversation that happens in that particular context, which means they're able to get social change to a much larger extent. But finally, let's just weigh against opening government, right? Because note the fact, we actually tell you why this change happens. OG has absolutely no framing of why this is likely to happen and how this actualizes in societies. We tell you because of the fact that you have media narratives, you're likely to actually get this worse in a far extent. The only thing that OG says in terms of change is saying that, oh, there are social movements that influence the way that people think in Prime Minister. But that's not enough. What actually changes people is not talking about things like common topics, because you can presumably talk about things like common topics even if you have identity markers uniquely on you. What distinguishes this is what Rito tells you in terms of subconscious biases. It'll be explained to you when we talk about the fact that people uniquely treat you at the very first instance based on what you're wearing or based on how you're behaving. That doesn't come to you in opening government, which is what puts us over them as well. But finally, just note the fact that they have this very weird make in terms of government lobbying when they talk about the fact that you can just lobby governments, and even if they come from majority backgrounds. The actual mechanism is to build up support by shifting up the overturn window, which is what we prove to you. Closing government.
Cool. Am I audible? Is it clear? Okay, corny stuff then. So DATO as a society has come a long way from not getting slots in 2020 to actually reaching such spots where they're able to break competitions and break at competitions, especially the offline one, and as prestigious as NALSAR. I think it's something that's a win in and of itself, even if we don't win this finals. And thanks to all my friends and my teammate for supporting me throughout. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with closing government is that they say that this debate is placed in a centrist society, while they fall in the same trap of using OG's framing that people are extreme, politicians are extreme, they are majoritarian in nature, media spins narratives in a way that's going to harm minorities. Centrist societies won't operate that way. Centrist society probably has social movements who can counteract the kind of forces that majoritarian push on them. So you have same kind of balances and checks and balances that exist. If those balances don't exist on closing government's world and media can spin any narrative that they want, I think they're just debating this motion in a right-wing majority. Same goes for opening government. Extreme characterization. They tell us that people need to save their lives in the first place. Self-defense becomes a mechanism, right? I think the idea is if you conform and if you pander to your oppressor is the way you're able to survive, because your identity itself itself goes away. There are multiple issues with Gov's case. Firstly, your identity is not something that you choose. It's something that you're born with as a consequence of birth lottery. This means if you're black, you're likely to remain black throughout your life. You can't become like whites all of a sudden just because you are on the same page like becoming, like say, an American or an English person. Rashford is English, but he's still black. You can't take away those kind of identity markers that exist viscerally. But secondly, this is more important. There are subliminal identity markers. This means the way you go ahead and eat, the way you go ahead and dress up, the way you go ahead and engage with people are also identity markers. So sure, you might consider yourself American if you are working like a 9-to-5 job in a capitalistic company like Facebook. The problem still exists that if you're going ahead and eating like something else, you might go ahead and like face backlash primarily based on this. Probably that example does not make sense, but anyway, the idea is that cultures still are going to go ahead and push back against you primarily because of those sub-level identity markers that don't go away and people's biases that are ingrained into them also don't go away. Why is identity the most important? This is about the Rito questions. Identity is something that like I said, you can't choose, but secondly, you're conditioned to believe that this is something that you have to uphold throughout your life. So your parents, your friends, your communities are built on your identity. If you're born in a black as a black person, you're actually born in a black community in like USA. That means your friends around you are also black. Your parents and your communities is largely comprised of people who are coming from the same identity markers, right? Things like football and money, which he says are also competing incentives. I think those kind of incentives don't hold value to an extent identity does. Why? Because the other incentives are fleeting and they can change over time. So you might like Real Madrid today, but you can like Manchester United the next day. Same goes for money. You might like a high-paying job, low satisfaction, but you can also like a low-paying job with high satisfaction. All these things are fleeting. However, identity and you being black cannot be changed over time. That means you hold a higher degree of obligation towards it, and identity becomes crucial for you to go ahead and justify your spot in society in the first place, right? What is our extension and why do we win this debate? The side tells you that distinctiveness, and this is a clash on OG and O and CG. O says that distinctiveness means it's only positive, drives discourse, and people come to know that something's off, and there's like, we go ahead and solve this problem in a positive manner. If you don't do it, it's bust on the rug. CG says distinctiveness can be weaponized negatively. The problem is it doesn't matter if either of those two things work or don't work. Policy change something that is extreme, and we don't go for that high-hanging fruit. We go ahead and tell you that recognition of a problem in and of itself, even if it leads to a negative outcome as in CG's best case scenario, is important. Why is recognition the most important thing? Because it gives the majority or ingrains this idea of reparative obligation to their head through generations. If you don't have the reparative obligations, if you go ahead and just absolve the idea of reparative obligation from these people, they'll always come to think in the next generation that our conscience is clear, we didn't do anything wrong with this particular person. The problem is that these people are the ones who actually lock these people in certain social ladders, and these people are the ones who put them into certain boxes. I think that reparative obligation needs to pass on to generations and they should not have the ability to absolve themselves of it. Even in Gov's best case scenario where they were able to bring about, say, constructive, if they are able to save themselves from the most proximate harm, the idea is that proximate harm in and of itself is something that gets absorbed, that doesn't get solved. Because if your child comes ahead and you might be conforming to a culture, but if your child comes ahead and wants to deviate, there comes no opt-out mechanism. Opt-out itself is the most important thing, right? Note, and this is where I flip backlash also that comes from Gov benches. I think at all points of time, if you conform to a culture, and that culture is a majority culture, you celebrate the same festivals. What happens is, even if you have certain kind of identity markers that you use to go ahead and deviate from all norms that this culture pushes onto you, I think the backlash just increases, because now people think that you're diluting their culture and they want to preserve their own identity in the first place. That dilution of culture is a proximate harm to the majority. That means now they use this and weaponize it against you even more. And in more instances than not, you're likely to go ahead and have this kind of deviation from those norms because of your identity that comes from you, that's ingrained into you from get-go, right? If you and you can't just perfectly become like a white rich man if you're a black person. There is no way you have the same kind of taste, there's no way you have the same kind of like culture or like the assimilation that you want or the kind of position you have in society. At that point of time, the backlash increases, and I think Gov's all arguments of backlash then gets flipped. Before I go on, yeah. Okay. So again, you're breaking this debate to a level where if you place this debate in WLDs where there's more liberalism, you might get policy change. If it's like in a country that's more extreme, conservative, you might not get policy change. The idea is that this debate is not placed in these certain countries. The idea is that you at least go ahead and recognize the problem in and of itself. Recognition of the problem can only come about when you don't let the majority absolve themselves from the harm that they've inflicted upon you through generation. That recognition itself becomes a value positive thing. But like even if it goes against you, the idea remains that you can go ahead and gradually bring about change. The aspiration of as a person does not go out the window, because aspiration is something that becomes inherent to you, because now you feel that problem is there and you want to go ahead and solve this particular problem and increase your level of happiness. I think that aspirational value that you get from this particular like not absolving the majorities of this is a net value positive thing that we get on our side. I think at that point of time, the Bayan's idea of like say certainty of happiness is something that they guarantee because you conform is also farcical, because because if you go ahead and deviate, you won't be happy. Marcus Rashford will still be abused because he's black, even if he says that he's English, even if he says that, okay, I play for the English football team. That still exists. Those kind of biases of people against you don't go away because of your actions and your identity that you inherently hold. You don't choose it. That's why you can't let it go in the first place. And that means opt-out also becomes extremely difficult for you. But even if you go ahead and do opt-out, I think the backlash just increases on their side. How that means the gradual change that they want to compound on their side house never happens. I think at that point of time, our extension of why you need to just recognize the problem in the first place is something that's important, because it does not let the majorities go ahead and absolve themselves of the idea that they did something wrong to you. I think those repetitive obligation and the idea of like you identifying this and keeping this on through generations means that you can bring out certain structural change as society progresses forward. I think that itself is something that brings about ground level change, and that's something that we pose on for all those reasons.
Please be seated. Mithun, who is outside, just tell them to come in. We're starting now. Please be seated. We're starting now. Yeah, right now. Huh? Oh, they'll come in a minute. The deliberation is done. All cool. We can just start. So we can start. Mic check. Offline after 3 years, and we were extremely excited about it. Like every member of the 17-member OC here really worked their ass off to pull this event for you guys, and each of these members are conducting an offline tournament of any sort for the first time. So we didn't have a precedent, we didn't have a previous institutional memory to conduct this event. Everything had to be built from the scratch. so that the next IV happens in a more smoother manner. So we had to figure out a lot of micro issues on every part of the event. As hard it was fun. And the OC worked tireless to bring you the IV you see today. And when you talk about the OC, I wouldn't be doing justice if I just mention it as a 17-member committee. Firstly, I'd want to introduce my OC. Sandy Bhatia, she was the head of logistics. She was working out the logistics of the event even when she was drunk. And second is Shamik, that man is always high on my numbers. Third, Megan Sequeira, the food trucks you have today is like completely out for her. And Tanvi, Shipra, Suhani, Anshul, Teja, yeah, I owe you a treat. Diti, Anand, I'm happy with the designs. Nupur, Trisha literally handled all your Akko scenes and they made you happy that night, like the Saturday night is all on them. And Atharva, Ovipsha, Sushmita, Shruti and Karthik. So this is the 17-member OC on paper, but I would really think that the 17-member OC is not all of it. There are a lot more. Firstly, DGV Ritik, the guy who's standing right here. This man is in one-man army. He knows every inch of this arcade block. He has like he just knows this place properly. And this is his last IV, I do see that. And firstly, I would like to say that that IV banner is going to go to his room tomorrow. He's literally been a bigger brother to me at NALSAR. I can't be more grateful for this event to any senior more than this man. Secondly, Arjun, he has been a bigger brother to me ever since I entered the DEPCOM. Yeah, he shouted at me, he ensured that I worked, and I'm really happy that I'm here. So thirdly, Sanskar Jain, that guy, like, everything he got on Saturday night is probably because of him. And then we have Jay, Abhinand, and Bhavani Singh Rajpurohit, Avni, Rohan, Sohail. These guys are not a part of the OC. They came and worked just because we asked them to. That it was a completely personal favor to me and the IV, and I'm really, really, really grateful for them. And then I'd like to thank my equity team, Kushi Mittal. She is literally the happiest person on campus. And then we have Karthik Subramaniam. I think that man can practically handle any problem that arises here. And then we have Saranya Ravindran. She's completely low-key, but like, Saranya, you're really, really good, and I really thank you. And then I have to thank my administration. Irrespective of who was the Vice Chancellor in the college, they really, really helped us. Any permission that I sought for the IV or any request that I needed for the IV was granted to ensure that this event happens smooth. So it is just not just like the debaters of NALSAR, but NALSAR understands that how important IV is in this college. And next, I personally want to thank Chidambaram sir. Any problem I had at any moment of time, I always ran to that man. He literally helped me out to pull this event. And then I have to thank all the driver annas who drove like 3 a.m. in the midnight, 2 a.m. in the midnight to ensure that everybody reached back to their hotels. Ganesh Anna, Ravi Anna, Mujahid Anna, and Anwar Anna. And then IT department, Irfan sir, he literally like, he managed like a lot of things. The live streaming is happening because of him. A lot of times, a lot of wires get cracked and a lot of things happen campus. I know NALSAR network sucks, but at the end of the day, even if we can pull an event like this, because it's probably because of him. And then finally, I'd like to thank all the ACAD block people, which is Mr. Shankar, Ratnam, and Mr. Prabhakar. And then with that, now since my core is here, I would like to take my moment to thank them. Firstly, I would like to thank Pranav Kagilkar. So, I can't be more grateful to have a core like this man. So ever since I asked him to be the core of NALSAR, he has literally taken up holding IV as his personal responsibility. So every time after every conversation, he would tell me that let's make this IV great. And I really believe that he has stood up to his word, and I really owe him a lot. And I know he has been a part of IV before and here as a core. IV generally has a policy of not repeating a core, but if we could repeat one person, I think it could be Pranav Kagilkar. Secondly, I want to thank Aina. So I've personally seen her debate and I literally went like, wow, like she's really crazy good, and her WDC break was like literally mad, and literally like I really think that if I ever admired a debater on stage like that, I really couldn't like name some other person than Aina Rai Bajani. And I really thank Aira Gosavi. She always keeps her calm, and when I sit on her verdict, I feel like I want to listen to it, even though I'm not a part of the debate. I really thank her too. And then Vinodan Kupuswamy, he flew all the way from Malaysia for us. And I think every time he chaired, I always heard that his room was happy. So even if he gave you a 4th, he would make you believe that you deserve the 4th. And with that being said, I'd hand over the mic to Pranav to announce the results.
Like before the announcement of the winners, just a couple of things that I want to say on behalf of the ACHCO. First is a big thank you to Arif and the entire team. I think they've put in a lot of effort to getting NALSAR back offline. Like I think as was evident by all the 8 speakers who spoke about how much NALSAR meant to them, because NALSAR is the the international equivalent of a national, and NALSAR has always consistently ensured that they give us enough room as CAs to have as many judges as we want, and they've taken really good care of us in every aspect. So a huge thank you to Arif and his team for that. I think the other thing is, and this is probably a very cliche thing, is but like the teams are actually that make up the competition, that put the faith in the ACHCO and pay the reg fee and travel all the way to debate at NALSAR, and we really appreciate you guys coming here. I think we can say probably that the future is bright for the Indian circuit, and I really hope that all of y'all keep debating more often. Maybe a bit of online, a bit of offline, both. And I'm really hoping that we see you, we as in, like Sauradeep and others see you at Madrid, and like all of us see you at Bali as well at ABP, because I think it's about time we have more than one Indian breaking team at a major. Yeah, and obviously just a thank you to TAB and Equity for all the effort that they do. We always thank them, but like the amount of effort that it takes to put in conflicts, to evaluate concerns, to ensure that the TAB is ready on time is really great. And I'm going to give it to Ira to say a couple of things.
I just want to say one thing. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I also just want to give a shout out to all of the NCMs that attended this tournament. And I know that this circuit and this space is extremely difficult to navigate as an NCM. And I hope that at some point we see more than one in the finals and the finals panels, etc. I just hope for not even a second that you doubt yourself and you continue in this activity and remember why you started in the first place. I'll make the announcements. Okay, fine.
This one also to announce your Equity team.
No, I won't do it.
No, chairs will announce them.
Okay, let's just start. Okay.
Do it. Why don't you take one and I'll take the other one?
Yeah, we'll alternate.
Yeah, okay. Are we ready? Okay, guys. So we're going to start with the top 5 novice speakers. Are you displaying? What's going on? No, next. Novice speakers. Oh, what is happening? We're doing top 5 novice speakers. On first, we have Aman Goyal from the team Mystic Falls with an average score of 76.60. Second, we have Priya Shukla from team VIT Angry Feminist Tech with an average score of 76.2. The third best novice speaker is Vaibhav with an average score of 76. We have a tie on the fourth best novice speaker, Vagarth with an average score of 75.8, and Yashovardhan with an average score of 75.8. Oh, sorry, there's another one. We have Yash with an average score of 75.8 as well. You want to open best speakers? Or you want to judge them?
So now there's a trophy for the best novice speaker.
There's a trophy for the best novice speaker, so if you just could come ahead.
If you're here, that is.
If you're here. Is it
No, not here. Okay, move on. Yeah. Next
okay.
time.
Okay. Since they're not here, we're going to now announce the best open speakers. The best speaker of this tournament is Lavanya Puri with an average score of 80.6.
Yeah, I figured.
Fuck it now.
Listen. Listen. I think switch that thing off. Like, it's okay.
Yeah, that's useless now.
Okay, guys, this is obvious. We've done it in a reverse order, but like, come on. It's fine.
Okay, the second best open speaker is Robin Ahuja with an average score of 80.4. The third best open speaker is Harshvardhan Ray with an average score of 78.8. Okay, there are ties for the fourth best open speaker. We have Soumitra with an average score of 78.6. We have Rohan with an average score of 78.6. We have Vansh with an average score of 78.6. There's also a tie for the seventh best open speaker. We have Manasija with an average score of 78.2. Rita Brata with an average score of 78.2 as well. Angad with an average score of 78.2. V. Sayaram with an average score of 78.2. Yeah, Pran's going to now announce the best judges of the tournament. Now do ulta. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get the order reversed this time. So the third best judge of the tournament is Mahesh. The second best judge of the tournament is Abhishek. Okay, I don't think Abhishek's here, never mind. And the best judge of this tournament is Chinmay. He's waving like the royal family on the balcony from there. Is the chair of the novice finalist Cheshta here?